June 1944. While the eyes of the world were fixed on the beaches of Normandy beaches, where the Allies landed in what was called Operation Overlord in the east, something much larger was beginning to move. Silent, invisible, calculated. The German High Command believed they were seeing the whole picture, but in reality, they were only seeing a part of it. Intelligence reports indicated that the next major Soviet strike would come from the south, in Ukraine. That was where the Germans focused their concern. That was where they expected the storm. Mobile divisions were deployed to that region, strategic reserves as well. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Eastern Front, in the vast and swampy Belarus, the army group center it remained scattered across hundreds of kilometers. It looked solid on paper. In practice, it was a line that was too thin to support that much weight. The troops were entrenched in dense forests, destroyed villages, and flooded fields. The defenses had been improvised over months. Many soldiers were exhausted veterans, survivors of brutal winters and endless battles. Others were recruits too young, sent to fill gaps that should never have existed. There was a shortage of fuel. There was a shortage of heavy ammunition. There was a shortage of mobile reserves capable of reacting quickly to a disruption. But in Berlin, this was ignored. Hitler was convinced that holding a position was synonymous with strength. Retreating was weakness. Every city, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, was to be transformed into a fortress. No commander was authorized to make a strategic retreat. No line could be shortened to facilitate defense. It was an absolute order. Defend to the last man. Imagine the pressure on the generals at the front. They knew their lines were stretched too far. They knew the Red Army was building up forces. Reconnaissance planes reported increasing Soviet movements. Partisans attacked railways behind German lines almost every night. But every request to withdraw was refused. Meanwhile, on the other side of the line, the Soviets were doing something the Germans hadn't realized in time. They were amassing forces on a colossal scale. Entire divisions were being transferred at night. Tanks were hidden under camouflage nets. Heavy artillery was silently positioned in the forests. More than 2 million soldiers were being trained, and the army group center scattered, static, bound by rigid orders. It became exactly what the Soviet command wanted, an immobile target. The trap wasn't just a military one, it was psychological. The Germans believed they were safe in the center because the great spectacle of the war was taking place in France. They believed the enemy would attack where they had attacked before in the south. But war is not about repeating patterns, it's about breaking them. And in that sweltering June, while German soldiers dug trenches and reinforced positions, believing they were relatively out of the main focus, a storm was brewing on the horizon. Not an ordinary storm, but a bombing that would make the ground shake like never before. In the early morning of June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, the fate of the Eastern Front began to change irreversibly. The date was not chosen by chance, it was symbolic. On June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht had crossed the Soviet borders with devastating speed, initiating the largest land invasion in history. Now, 3 years later, the Red Army was preparing its response, and it would not be just a counterattack, it would be a crushing defeat. Before dawn, the front line was shrouded in a heavy silence. A thin mist covered the fields and forests of Belarus. German soldiers in the trenches rubbed their eyes, exhausted after sleepless nights, accustomed to localized attacks, Soviet patrols, and occasional artillery fire. Many believed that this would be just another day of constant but controllable tension. Then, in the early hours of the morning, the horizon exploded. Thousands of Soviet artillery pieces opened fire almost simultaneously. The roar was so intense it sounded like a single, continuous thunderclap. The ground began to tremble as if it were being ripped apart from below. Trees were uprooted, wooden shelters shattered like fragile toys. The earth rose to the sky in black columns mixed with smoke and shrapnel. It was no ordinary bombardment. It was a meticulously planned artillery preparation, coordinated down to the second. For hours, large-caliber howitzers, heavy mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers poured tons of explosives over German positions. Telephone lines were cut almost instantly. Command posts disappeared under smoking craters. Messengers attempting to run between trenches were struck by shrapnel before they could reach 50 meters. Dazed German soldiers pressed their bodies against the ground, feeling the vibration pass through their bones. Some shouted orders that no one could hear. Others simply prayed. The air was thick with dust, gunpowder, and the metallic smell of blood. When the bombing finally began to subside, it brought no relief. It brought something worse. On the other side of the smokescreen, Soviet forces advanced. Mass infantry emerged from the forests, supported by T-34 tanks that advanced heavily through terrain the Germans deemed too difficult for armored vehicles. Engineers quickly cleared paths through minefields. Specialized units attacked strategic points with surprising precision. The attack was not concentrated in a single sector. It spread across a vast expanse of the front, simultaneously striking multiple positions of Army Group Center. It was impossible to know where the main blow was. Each German commander believed he was under the decisive attack. Divisions on the front line began to fragment. In some sectors, the trenches had simply ceased to exist. Survivors emerged disoriented, with torn uniforms and faces, covered in dirt and dried blood. Many officers were dead or wounded, and the chain of command began to dissolve in the first hours of the offensive. German attempts to respond were swift but uncoordinated. Local reserves were sent to contain gaps that had already turned into deep breaches. Without efficient communications, some units advanced to counterattack positions that were already lost. Others awaited orders that would never arrive. Meanwhile, the Red Army maintained its pace. The offensive was not only massive, it was meticulously planned. Soviet intelligence had identified specific weak points, sectors where the defenses were most stretched. It was there that the artillery concentrated its maximum power. It was there that the armored vehicles broke through with the greatest speed. By the end of the first day, the German line already showed deep cracks. In certain places, Soviet forces had advanced several kilometers. For an army accustomed to resisting with rigidity and discipline, this was a brutal shock. What was happening wasn't just an attack, it was the beginning of a structural collapse. German commanders began to realize something alarming. This was not a limited offensive to recover ground. It was an operation of total destruction. The objective was not to push the enemy back, but to surround, isolate, and crush them. And as the sun set on that 22nd of June, 1944, illuminating devastated fields and columns of smoke, rising to the reddened sky, it became clear that the storm the Germans had ignored had finally arrived, and she didn't intend to stop. When the first impact of the offensive began to spread along the German line, one of the most critical points was the city of Vitebsk. For the German command, Vitebsk was not just a city on the map, it was a bastion, an anchor point that supported the entire northern wing of Army Group Center. Hitler had declared the place a fortress. This meant one simple and cruel thing: no retreat under any circumstances. The German troops stationed there, several infantry divisions supported by artillery, were spread out in defensive positions around the city, protecting roads and railway crossings. On paper, it looked like an organized defense. In practice, it was a dangerous salient, projecting into the Soviet lines, vulnerable to a pincer movement. And that's exactly what happened. In the days following the start of the offensive, Soviet forces advanced with almost surgical precision north and south of Vitebsk. While the infantry pressed forward, Armored units broke through newly created gaps in the German defenses. T-34 tanks appeared on secondary roads where the Germans believed themselves to be relatively safe. The sound of Soviet engines began to be heard behind the defensive positions. It was the worst possible scenario. German communications were becoming increasingly fragmented. Confused reports spoke of enemy columns already cutting supply. Roads that should have served as escape routes were under artillery fire. Soviet planes attacked any visible movement during the day. Trucks exploded in flames. Horses fell under shrapnel. Soldiers ran into the forests trying to escape the aerial bombardment. Inside Vitebsk, the atmosphere was one of growing tension. Officials knew they were being surrounded. Requests for permission to withdraw were sent. The response was negative. The order was clear: hold the city at all costs. But the cost was becoming unbearable. Within a few days, the encirclement was complete. The German divisions were utterly isolated. Without adequate supplies, with limited ammunition and virtually no air support, they fought in increasingly desperate conditions. Every attempt to mount a cohesive defense was thwarted by new bombardments. The fighting became chaotic and brutal. In the city streets and surrounding areas, the fighting took place house by house, trench by trench. Grenades exploded in narrow corridors. Machine guns swept through makeshift positions. The smell of smoke, gunpowder, and burnt flesh permeated the air. Some groups tried to break through the encirclement during the night. Small columns advanced silently through the forests, attempting to cross Soviet lines, but most were detected. Flares illuminated the sky. Bursts of machine gun fire cut through the darkness. Many died without even seeing the enemy that struck them. Others simply surrendered, exhausted, hungry, wounded. For many German soldiers, Vitebsk became a mass grave. Within days, 5 German divisions were virtually annihilated. The city fell. What remained of the units ceased to exist as an organized force. The salient that had once seemed a stronghold had become a deadly trap. The impact was devastating not only in human terms, but strategically as well. With Vitebsk destroyed, the northern wing of Army Group Center was exposed. The rupture was no longer a possibility. It was a concrete reality. The collapse at Vitebsk was the first major sign that this Soviet offensive was not just another battle in the long war in the East. It was the beginning of a large-scale disintegration. And while the last pockets of resistance were crushed amidst smoldering ruins and blood-soaked fields, the Soviet offensive continued to advance ever deeper. The trap was working exactly as planned. With Vitebsk crushed to the north, the next blow fell on 2 fundamental pillars of the German line, Orsha and Mogilev. These cities were not merely urban centers. They were vital logistical hubs. Orsha controlled important railway lines and roads that connected central Belarus to the interior of the occupied territory. Mogilev, on the banks of the Dnieper River, was considered a natural defensive position, protected by water, trenches, and fortifications built over months. On paper, they were fortresses. In reality, they became marked targets. After the initial breakthrough on June 22nd, the Soviets maintained the pace of the offensive with almost mathematical precision. The attack was not disorganized. Each sector had a clear function. While some units pressed frontally, others sought deep infiltrations, cutting roads and isolating pockets of resistance. In Orsha, the initial bombardment was devastating. Soviet artillery concentrated heavy fire on known German artillery positions, communication centers, and troop concentration areas. The city began to burn within the first few days. Warehouses exploded. Railway wagons loaded with ammunition turned into fireballs visible for miles around. The Germans tried to respond with local counterattacks. Armored units were launched to try to stem the Soviet tide, but there was a lack of coordination. There was a lack of fuel. There was a lack of significant air support. Many tanks were sent into combat with already exhausted crews, facing overwhelming numbers. The Soviets, in turn, advanced with infantry closely supported by armored vehicles. The need to cooperation between tanks and foot soldiers was far more refined than in previous years of the war. Wherever a German resistance point arose, it was immediately saturated with artillery or surrounded by rapid maneuvers. The streets of Orsha had become corridors of death. Fighting took place inside partially destroyed buildings. Staircases covered in rubble served as makeshift firing positions. Grenades were thrown from one floor to another. Soldiers fought just meters apart, often unable to clearly see the enemy because of the smoke and dust. While Orsha was collapsing, the situation in Mogilev was becoming equally critical. Mogilev had been declared a fortress by direct order of Hitler. This meant that no retreat was permitted. The city was to be held at all costs, even if it meant a complete siege. And the siege began. Soviet forces crossed the Dnieper River at several points, using makeshift bridges under constant fire. Engineers worked under bombardment, erecting temporary structures while comrades fell around them. As soon as the crossing was secured, armored units began to cross, rapidly expanding the bridgehead. The pressure on Mogilev became unsustainable. The German defenders were becoming increasingly isolated. Supply routes were being bombed daily. Trains were being destroyed before reaching the city. Ammunition was running low. Wounded soldiers piled up in makeshift shelters, many without adequate medical care. When the Soviets finally launched the direct assault, it was with overwhelming force. Artillery cleared the way. Tanks advanced through the destroyed avenues. Infantry followed close behind, clearing pockets of resistance. The fighting was intense and short. With no possibility of organized retreat, and under constant pressure, the German defenses began to fragment. Small groups tried to escape westward, but many were intercepted on the roads or in the surrounding forests. Within a few days, both Orsha and Mogilev were in Soviet hands. What this meant strategically was devastating. The center of the German line was being breached in multiple places. The fortresses that were supposed to anchor the defense became traps that consumed entire divisions. And what was most alarming for the German command was the speed. There was no time to reorganize. There was no room to stabilize the front. Each lost city opened a new breach, and each breach allowed Soviet armored forces to advance even deeper. The road to Minsk was beginning to open up, and behind her the specter of total encirclement began to take shape. With Vitebsk destroyed and Orsha and Mogilev in collapse, the German defensive structure in the center of Belarus was no longer a line. It was a succession of gaps connected by congested roads and disoriented units. And it was precisely at this moment that the Soviets launched the decisive element of the operation, their armored formations in depth. As soon as the breaches were opened by the infantry and artillery, the tank armies went into action. Columns of T-34s advanced, raising clouds of dust and smoke. They did not move hesitantly. They did not stop to consolidate each meter gained. The objective was not to slowly push back the enemy, it was to cut through them. Soviet doctrine had evolved since the disasters of 1941. Now, the attack was coordinated in layers. The first wave broke through the front. The second exploited the open space. The third dove deep, targeting bridges, intersections, communication, centers, vital points that kept the German army functioning like a machine. And that machine started to malfunction. The roads of Belarus became corridors of panic. German units that believed they were retreating to reorganize found Soviet tanks already ahead of them. Trucks loaded with supplies were hastily abandoned. Officers tried to reorganize columns under constant aerial fire. The Luftwaffe, which had been decisive at other times during the war, was practically absent. Soviet air Superiority allowed for continuous attacks against any visible concentration of troops. Ground attack aircraft dove on retreating columns, firing rockets and machine guns. Roads were blocked by destroyed vehicles. Horses, still widely used for transport, fell under explosions. The German soldiers, exhausted and often lacking clear information, felt that the enemy was everywhere at once. Radio messages were intercepted or simply didn't arrive. Telephone lines had been destroyed since the first days of the offensive. All that remained was improvisation. In some sectors, commanders attempted to organize local counterattacks with what they still had available. A few tanks, anti-tank guns, scattered battalions, but they faced forces far superior in number and coordination. Each isolated attempt at resistance was quickly flanked. The speed of the Soviet advance was the most terrifying factor. It was no longer a line slowly retreating under pressure. It was a deep penetration in which armored units traversed dozens of kilometers in a few days. Bridges were captured intact before they could be demolished. Strategic crossings fell before the German command even realized they were threatened. The concept of a continuous facade was beginning to disappear. Instead, a chaotic scenario emerged. Isolated pockets of resistance surrounded by mobile enemy forces. German soldiers would wake up believing they were in the rear, and hours later realize they were practically surrounded. Morale was beginning to suffer a devastating blow. Many veterans of the Eastern Front had already seen the worst: the winter, Stalingrad, Kursk. But there, in the summer of 1944, what was frightening was the feeling that control had been lost. The war of movement, which had once been a German specialty during the Blitzkrieg campaigns, was now in the hands of the Red Army. And the purpose of that offensive was beginning to become clear. It wasn't just to push Army Group Center back. It was close. As the Soviet columns advanced further and further west, the silhouette of Minsk began to emerge as the next major objective. And between the advancing tanks and the fragmented German divisions struggling to survive, a massive pincer movement slowly began to close. A siege was no longer a distant possibility. It was being designed right there on the battlefield, kilometer after kilometer, under the constant roar of Soviet engines. As Soviet tanks advanced westward at an astonishing speed, what had once been a front line began to transform into something far more dangerous for the Germans, a gigantic arc slowly closing in. The Soviet objective was not merely to push the enemy back. It was to encircle them. While armored forces swept through the breaches, open to the north and south, mobile units advanced deep into the area, ignoring isolated pockets of resistance. Villages with small German garrisons were simply left behind. The focus was on the main roads, the bridges over strategic, the rivers and the crossroads connecting central Belarus to the regional capital, Minsk. On the German side, the situation was becoming increasingly confusing. With Vitebsk destroyed and Orsha and Mogilev fallen, the divisions that remained in position began to receive contradictory orders. Some instructions demanded holding ground. Others spoke of retreating to new defensive lines. But these new lines were not even prepared. And what's worse, many of the evacuation routes were already under threat. German columns began moving westward in a desperate attempt to escape the advancing Soviets. Narrow roads, often surrounded by dense forests and swamps, became congested with trucks, towed artillery pieces, makeshift ambulances, and soldiers on foot. It was a scenario of increasing tension. Then came the air raids. Soviet aircraft constantly patrolled the retreat routes. As soon as they detected significant movement, they swooped down on the columns. Bombs exploded in the middle of the roads. Trucks were thrown off the dirt tracks. Munitions detonated in a chain reaction. Horses panicked. Soldiers ran to the sides of the ditches, trying to escape the hail of shrapnel. Within hours, many of these routes became impassable. Destroyed vehicles blocked the way. Wounded soldiers piled up without adequate care. Officers tried to reorganize the march under constant fire, but the feeling was that the enemy was always one step ahead. Meanwhile, the Soviet forces advancing from the north. and south began to converge. It wasn't a chaotic movement. It was coordinated. Entire armies moved like the two prongs of a gigantic pincer. Maps in German headquarters began to reveal a frightening reality. The Soviet frontiers were dangerously close to meeting west of Minsk. If that happened, dozens of German divisions would be trapped. Some commanders in the field perceived the danger before Berlin acknowledged the gravity of the situation. They requested authorization for an immediate withdrawal and reorganization behind shorter lines. The response, once again, was hesitant or negative. The order was to hold positions for as long as possible, but maintaining positions required something that was already running out: time. Each day, the Soviets advanced more kilometers. Bridges over secondary rivers were captured intact. Strategic crossings fell with almost no significant resistance, because German forces simply couldn't be everywhere at once. The German front was no longer a continuous line. It was a collection of isolated groups trying to maintain contact with each other amidst the chaos. In practice, the siege was almost complete before many soldiers even understood what was happening. As night fell, bonfires could be seen in the distance, villages ablaze, warehouses exploding, vehicles burning. The night sky reflected reddish hues over the forests of Belarus. The distant sound of artillery was constant, like thunder that never ceased. For many German soldiers, a quiet realization was beginning to emerge. They were no longer retreating to reorganize. They were running to avoid being swallowed up. And as the Soviet frontiers continued to draw closer, Minsk ceased to be just an important city. It was about to become the center of one of the largest sieges of World War II. The German despair, an abyss of shadows and ruins. In the pulsating heart of Belarus, where vast swamps intertwined with ancient forests and fields that once echoed with birdsong, the year 1944 transformed into a vortex of agony for the German forces of Army Group Center. What had begun as a static front, an illusion of stability after years of ephemeral conquests, now crumbled under the inexorable weight of the Soviet offensive, known as Operation Bagration. Minsk, the strategic jewel at the center of this theater of horrors, was no longer a distant bastion. It was the epicenter of a siege that closed like the jaws of a primal beast, hungry for revenge. The air carried the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder, churned earth, and the rancid sweat of human fear, while the merciless summer sun illuminated a panorama of chaos that transcended mere war and plunged into the realm of utter despair. Imagine, if you can, the moment when tension, that constant companion of the battlefields, transmutes into pure despair. It was not a subtle transition, but an abrupt plunge into the abyss. The German commanders, once masters of the blitzkrieg tactics that had swept across Europe like a steel hurricane, now found themselves reduced to shadows of their former selves. Generals like Walter Model, known for his fierce tenacity, or Ernst Busch, the commander of Army Group Center, no longer debated victory strategies in smoky rooms with detailed maps. Their dialogues, whispered in makeshift bunkers or around flickering campfires, revolved around stark survival. "How will we save our men?" echoed in their minds, not "how will we conquer more territory?" It was the twilight of an era, the end of the illusion of invincibility that Hitler and his high command had cultivated so vehemently. The reports arriving at headquarters were fragments of a nightmare unfolding. Exhausted messengers, riding rusty motorcycles or stumbling along muddy roads on foot, delivered crumpled pieces of paper hours, sometimes days late. 78th Division, contact lost after intense air bombardment in Bobruisk. 134th Regiment, right flank exposed, enemy advancing with T-34 tanks en masse. Entire units, assigned to guard vital flanks, evaporated into the ether of war. Some had been obliterated in lightning ambushes, their soldiers mowed down by bursts of Soviet machine gun fire, or crushed under the tracks of tanks that seemed like hordes of mechanical demons. Others, isolated in pockets of resistance, fought in a communication vacuum, without orders from higher command, without supplies, only with the ammunition remaining in their cartridge belts and the determination that terror corrodes like acid. In entire sectors, officers looked at obsolete maps, drawing imaginary lines where the front should have been. But the reality was a terrifying void. The front line had dissolved, swallowed by the red avalanche advancing from the east. Terror settled like a cold fog in the souls of these men. Veterans who had faced the merciless winter of 1941-42, when the Russian ice froze their engines and bones, now trembled not from the cold, but from the certainty of a worse fate. Remember Stalingrad, that cursed city on the banks of the Volga, where Paulus's Sixth Army had been surrounded and annihilated in 1943, with more than 90,000 prisoners dragged to the Siberian gulags, many never to return. Kursk, the titanic battle of 1943, where German panzers clashed with Soviet fortresses in a hell of fire and metal, leaving indelible scars on the Wehrmacht. But here, in June 1944, it was different. The Soviets, eager students of German lessons, now reversed the roles. Their tanks, produced in factories beyond the Urals, cut through German lines with a speed that evoked the ghosts of the 1941 Blitzkrieg, but with a fury multiplied by the memory of past invasions. Generals in the field, such as Kurt von Tippelskirch or Friedrich Hossbach, sent urgent messages by radio, their trembling voices cut by static. We request permission for immediate withdrawal, unsustainable lines, imminent catastrophic losses. The proposal was logical, almost pleading. Shorten the front, retreat to the Berezina River or beyond, save what remained of decimated divisions, and erect a new defensive barrier to the west. But from Berlin, the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Den where Hitler plotted his madness, came responses imbued with fanatical rigidity. Do not retreat, defend every meter of sacred Reich soil. Every Belarusian city, every village should be transformed into a Festung, an impregnable fortress, where the defenders would fight to the last cartridge. The word retreat was anathema, a poison that could infect the chain of command with doubt. Hitler, obsessed with his messianic vision, saw any retreat as treason, echoing the orders that condemned Stalingrad to oblivion. This disconnect, this abyss between the carnage of the front and the illusion of the distant bunker, was a collective death sentence. While the Soviets, under the command of generals like Zhukov and Rokossovsky, advanced with masterful coordination, heavy IS-2 tanks breaking through defenses, infantry charging, in inexorable waves, Sturmovik aircraft decimating German columns from the sky, the Wehrmacht divisions were shackled to obsolete positions. Rigid orders forced them to cling to land that was no longer worth the spilled blood. Instead of a coordinated retreat, which could preserve forces for future battles, units were forced to resist until their last breath, allowing the encirclement to close like a bear trap. The terror of this immobility was palpable. Soldiers felt the ground tremble with the approach of enemy tanks, knowing that every minute lost sealed their fate. On the dusty roads to Minsk, chaos reigned supreme, a pandemonium that would make Dante reconsider his vision of hell. Columns of military refugees. Yes, refugees. For they were no longer organized armies, mixed soldiers from disparate divisions, infantrymen from the 4th Armata alongside remnants of the 9th without a clear chain of command. Officers with torn uniforms and eyes bloodshot with fatigue shouted orders to gather scattered men, forming improvised groups that looked more like bands of fugitives than disciplined troops. Wounded men groaned in carts pulled by skeletal horses or were carried on the shoulders of comrades who could barely support their own weight. Mutilated arms hung inert, bandages soaked in pus and blood, while the scorching sun accelerated the putrefaction of the wounds. The smell of decomposition mingled with the stench of diesel and sweat, creating an atmosphere of collective nausea. Everything was lacking: fuel, the lifeblood of the war machines. Panther and Tiger tanks, once masters of the battlefields, were abandoned by the roadside, their crews forced to sabotage them with grenades to avoid capture. Artillery pieces, Pa-40 cannons that had halted Soviet assaults in past battles, lay inert because tractors had been destroyed or there was no gasoline to tow them. Sensitive documents, maps, codes, prisoner lists were burned in hasty bonfires. Clouds of black smoke rising like funeral signals to the sky. The feeling was of an inexorable clock ticking towards zero. Time was running out, and with it, hope. Soldiers looked towards the eastern horizon, where clouds of dust announced the Soviet advance, and whispered forgotten prayers or bitter curses against the Führer who had condemned them. Some commanders, forged in the fires of previous campaigns, broke the chains of blind obedience. Men like Colonel Hans von Luck, or equivalents in other units, acted on their own initiative, disobeying formal orders to initiate unauthorized retreats. It was an act of veiled rebellion, a risk that could lead to court-martial or summary execution for treason. But the alternative? Certain annihilation. The echo of Paulus at Stalingrad resounding in their minds. These leaders gathered their men for forced night marches, navigating dense forests where Belarusian partisans, vengeful ghosts of the woods, could ambush at any moment. Sporadic gunfire cut through the darkness, and the terror of an invisible bullet was constant. "Advance or die here," they shouted as panic spread like a plague. Meanwhile, the Soviet advance was a symphony of unstoppable destruction. Mobile units, such as the 5th Guards Tank Army, cut essential roads west of Minsk, isolating escape routes. Each blown-up bridge, each captured intersection, reduced the options to a funnel of death. The Pincers, the classic encirclement of Soviet doctrine, perfected after bitter lessons in 1941, were dangerously close to colliding. In Slutsk, in Borisov, in Orsha, cities fell like dominoes, and with them, thousands of Germans were engulfed. Morale, once the steel of the Wehrmacht, crumbled into a pit of despair. Veterans, with iron crosses hanging from scarred necks, now stared blankly into the void. They had survived the ice of Moscow, the mud of Kharkov, but now they faced the terror of an enemy that outnumbered them, outfired them, and in fury. "They come, like the hordes of Genghis Khan," they murmured, recalling Nazi propaganda that portrayed the Soviets as subhuman. But now reality reversed the script. It was the Germans who felt subjugated. At night, in the dark forests of Belarus, terror took on ethereal forms. Soldiers huddled in shallow trenches heard the distant roar of Soviet engines, a guttural rumble that pierced the bone. Isolated shots broke the silence, perhaps a sentry felled by an unseen sniper or a deserter executed by his own. "Comrades!" Explosions echoed, indicating that yet another vital road had been mined or bombed, sealing off escape routes. The night air carried whispers of panic, stories of partisans capturing stragglers, torturing them before a slow death. The fear of capture was worse than death in battle. Soviet prisoners recounted forced marches eastward, starvation, forced labor in Siberian mines, where the cold claimed more lives than bullets. The officers' mental map painted a grim picture of inevitability if nothing changed in the next few hours, and the rigid orders continued to arrive, empty echoes of a maddened leader. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, would be trapped in a huge pocket east of Minsk. The 4th Army, the 9th, fragments of the 3rd Panzer, all condemned to a cauldron of fire. What was at stake transcended territory. It was the existence of Army Group Center as a cohesive, combat-capable force. Losses estimated at over 300,000 men, unrecoverable. Equipment, a colossal breach in the Eastern Front that would allow the Soviets to march into Poland, to the gates of Germany. Despair was a poison corroding the collective soul. Soldiers abandoned equipment, deserted in small groups, or simply succumbed to torpor, awaiting the inevitable. On the muddy ground of Belarus, the war distilled its brutal, primal essence. No more grand strategies or lofty ideologies, only the raw choice. Break the encirclement, cutting through enemy lines in a suicidal charge, bayonets fixed and hoarse screams echoing in the night, or be crushed within it, squeezed between the Soviet hammer and the anvil of German intransigence itself. Men wept silently, recalling distant homes, farms in Bavaria, streets of Berlin, now unreachable. The terror was not abstract. It was the sound of approaching tanks, the smell of fresh earth from newly dug graves, the sight of comrades disemboweled by shrapnel. Despair enveloped everything like a shroud, and the horror of Bagration marked the beginning of the end, a prelude to the total collapse that would come in 1945. In this vortex, humanity dissolved, leaving only ghosts fighting against the inevitable. In the first days of July, the sounds of war already echoed around Minsk. The capital of Belarus, occupied by the Germans since 1941, had been transformed into a vital logistics hub for Army Group Center. Roads, depots, field hospitals, makeshift barracks, everything converged there. But now, the city was about to become the center of a monumental collapse. Soviet forces advancing from the north and south finally closed in enough to encircle the city to the west. The pincers met, cutting off the main escape routes. What remained of several German divisions was trapped in a huge pocket east and southeast of Minsk. In the early morning of July 3, 1944, Soviet troops launched the final assault on the city. The artillery cleared a path, hitting still active defensive positions. Although Minsk was already weakened by the collapse of the outer lines, resistance persisted. German units attempted to organize urban defenses, using partially destroyed buildings as firing points. But the Soviet pace was overwhelming. T-34 tanks advanced along the main avenues, accompanied by infantry moving from building to building. The urban combat was fast, intense, and violent. Bursts of machine gun fire echoed between facades marked by bullet holes. Grenades exploded in dark corridors. Shrapnel ricocheted off. Concrete walls. Some defenders fought to the end. Others, realizing they were isolated and without reinforcements, abandoned their positions and tried to escape westward, often too late. When the first Soviet units reached the city center, organized resistance began to crumble. Minsk was devastated. Much of the infrastructure had been destroyed during the German occupation or in recent fighting. Burned buildings, streets covered in rubble, abandoned vehicles. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air. Civilians who had survived the occupation slowly emerged from basements and makeshift shelters, watching the Red Armies advance with a mixture of relief and caution. For the Soviets, the capture of Minsk had profound significance. It was a strategic and symbolic military victory. The capital of Belarus was once again under Soviet control after 3 years of brutal occupation. But militarily speaking, the biggest drama wasn't happening inside the city. It happened outside of her. To the west and south, tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped in what would become known as the Minsk pocket. The encirclement was complete. Roads were blocked. Bridges were under Soviet control. Disorganized and exhausted German units desperately tried to find a breach. The liberation of Minsk, therefore, did not mark the end of the battle. It marked the beginning of its most ruthless phase. While Soviet flags were being raised on destroyed government buildings, one of the largest encircled troop encampments of the entire war was forming in the surrounding countryside. Army Group Center wasn't just retreating, he was being strangled. And within that pocket, thousands of men would realize in the coming hours that they were no longer fighting for territory nor for strategy. They were simply fighting to avoid disappearing. With the fall of Minsk on July 3, 1944, the encirclement ceased to be a threat and became a concrete reality. To the west of the city, Soviet forces had completely closed the pincers. To the east and southeast, what remained of much of Army Group Center was trapped. It was not a small, isolated group. There were tens of thousands of men, fragments of entire divisions, crammed into an ever-shrinking area, surrounded by Soviet forces that controlled roads, bridges, and strategic elevations. The so-called Minsk pocket was beginning to turn into a melting pot. Inside, disorganization reigned. Units that once belonged to different army corps were now mixed together without a clear chain of command. Officers tried to improvise defensive lines using what remained of ammunition and artillery. Many soldiers had gone days without adequate food. Fatigue was visible on faces covered in dirt and dried blood. Communication with high command was almost non-existent. Some radios still worked, but messages were fragmented, often impossible to decipher amidst interference and urgency. The predominant sound was that of Soviet artillery. Day and night, shells rained down on German concentrations. Forests offered some visual cover, but no real protection against the explosions. Each impact sent up columns of earth and shrapnel. Trees were cut in half. Makeshift shelters collapsed. Soviet aviation completed the aerial encirclement. During the day, any significant movement was quickly detected. Columns attempting to reorganize were attacked by rockets and bombs. The sky always seemed occupied by enemy aircraft. Inside the pocket, hope was running out. Some commanders still believed in a possible coordinated breakout. They gathered available troops and planned concentrated attacks against sectors considered weaker in the Soviet line. The idea was to open a temporary corridor that would allow some of the forces to escape, but each attempt ran into a cruel problem. The Soviets expected exactly that. The outer siege line was not improvised. It was supported by fresh, well-supplied units and backed by heavy artillery. As soon as the Germans tried to break through at a certain point, they were met with concentrated fire. The result was devastating. Entire groups were decimated before crossing even half the necessary distance. Remaining German tanks, few in number and with limited fuel, were destroyed by anti-tank guns or attacked by artillery. Soldiers advancing under cover of darkness were illuminated by flares and hit by machine guns. With each failed attempt, morale plummeted even further. Conditions inside the pocket were becoming increasingly brutal. Drinking water was scarce. Wounded soldiers piled up without sufficient medicine. Field doctors improvised surgeries with minimal resources. Many severely wounded soldiers simply could not be evacuated. The smell of gunpowder mingled with that of decomposing bodies in the areas most affected by the bombings. The siege wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The men knew they were isolated. They knew the enemy had overwhelming superiority in numbers and logistical support. They knew the chances of a rescue operation were virtually non-existent, and yet they continued fighting. Because within that enclave, the alternative to fighting was surrender or death. As the siege tightened day by day, what remained of Army Group Center ceased to be an organized force. It became a collection of groups trying to survive in an ever-shrinking space. The Minsk pocket was not just another episode of the war. It was the point at which one of the most powerful formations of the German army was being slowly crushed under the weight of an offensive that had been planned to leave no escape. And the worst was yet to come. Inside the Minsk pocket, when it became clear that the siege would not be lifted by any outside help, only one option remained: to break through on their own. The decision was not simple. To break through meant concentrating what remained of men, ammunition and vehicles in a single point, betting everything on a fierce attack, and attempting to breach Soviet lines that were prepared for precisely that move. But remaining stationary meant being slowly crushed by artillery, hunger, and attrition. Some generals gathered what remained of their forces and organized breakthrough columns. The order was to advance preferably at night, using the darkness as an ally. Tanks that were still operational, few in number and with rationed fuel, would be placed at the front to clear the way. Behind them, infantry, light artillery, and hundreds of foot soldiers would follow in tight formation. On the chosen night, The silence was almost absolute. Men walked cautiously through the forests of Belarus. Their objective was to reach a sector of the Soviet line considered less reinforced. Many carried only the essentials, a weapon, some ammunition, perhaps a nearly empty canteen. Then the shooting started. The Soviets, alert to any movement, launched flares that turned the night into a ghostly glow. The trees cast long, distorted shadows. Machine guns opened fire. Light artillery began to fall on the likely routes of advance. The rupture turned into chaos. The German tanks leading the column were hit by strategically positioned anti-tank guns. Some exploded, blocking the path of those behind. Soldiers tried to navigate around the wreckage under a hail of bullets. Shouts of command mingled with explosions and the dry sound of gunfire piercing the wood of the trees. Some groups managed to penetrate the Soviet front line. Hand-to-hand combat took place in clearings and narrow trails. Grenades were thrown just meters away. Bayonets were used in quick and brutal clashes. But even when a small group managed to get through one position, they would find another line just ahead. The siege was not a single barrier. It was composed of layers. Many soldiers who managed to advance a few kilometers got lost in the forests without clear directions. Some ended up surrounded again. Others, isolated and without supplies, wandered for days before being captured or killed. There were instances of small groups actually escaping, men who, exhausted and hungry, managed to cross Soviet lines and reach German positions to the west. But these were exceptions. For most, the attempts to break away resulted in devastating losses. At dawn, after each failed attempt, the scene was desolate. Bodies scattered among broken trees, abandoned equipment, burned vehicles still emitting thin smoke in the cold morning air. Each failure further reduced the chances of a successful new attempt. Inside the pocket, the sense of inevitability grew. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The number of wounded was increasing. The units no longer had enough cohesion to organize large-scale coordinated offensives. What remained was fragmented resistance, and little by little, the Soviet encirclement fulfilled its purpose, not only to prevent escape, but to wear down and completely destroy the enemy trapped within it. Army Group Center was being disintegrated not in a single dramatic blow, but in successive desperate attempts that ended in bloodshed and silence. Total destruction was imminent. After the escape attempts failed, Army Group Center was crushed inside the pocket. Without supplies, without coordination, and under constant bombardment, the German units collapsed. The Soviets tightened the siege methodically, destroying isolated resistance and capturing tens of thousands of exhausted and starving soldiers. The result was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of casualties and the near-total destruction of one of the Wehrmacht's main formations. The German line in Belarus ceased to exist, and the path for Soviet advancement towards Central Europe was opened. When what remained of Army Group Center ceased to exist as an organized force, the effect was not merely local. It was not just the fall of Minsk. It was not just the collapse of a few divisions. It was a strategic earthquake across the entire Eastern Front. For years, the center of the German line in the east had served as the backbone of the Nazi occupation of the Soviet Union. It connected the northern and southern army groups. It supported vital logistical routes. It protected access to Poland and beyond to German territory itself. Now that spine was broken. With the destruction around Minsk, a gigantic void opened up on the front. There were not enough troops to immediately fill the gap. German strategic reserves were limited. Many had already been moved to other sectors, especially after the Allied landings in France. The result was brutal. The Red Army began to advance almost without encountering organized resistance in several areas. Cities that once seemed distant became immediate targets. Belarus was quickly retaken. Roads that had been used by the Wehrmacht for 3 years now served the Soviet advance. Bridges, depots, and railway hubs passed into Soviet hands one after another. The logistical impact on Germany was devastating. With the loss of Belarus, German supply lines shortened chaotically and in a disorganized manner. Troops attempting to regroup found themselves constantly pressured by Soviet forces that did not slow down. Furthermore, the collapse in the center forced the German command to withdraw units from other sectors to try to form a new defensive line further west. This further weakened already fragile positions. The war of attrition had transformed into a war of movement, and now it was the Red Army that dominated this type of combat. Politically, the impact was also profound. The liberation of Belarus greatly strengthened the Soviet position vis-à-vis its allies. It demonstrated that the Soviet Union had not only withstood the German invasion, but now had the capacity to destroy entire armies in large-scale, coordinated offensives. For the Soviet population, it was a historic revenge. The date chosen for the start of the offensive, June 22nd, carried symbolic weight. 3 years. Earlier, Germany had launched its invasion. Now, the return blow was crushing. On the German side, confidence in the stability of the Eastern Front disappeared. The idea of a solid defensive line that could contain the Soviets began to seem illusory. Each new map showed red arrows advancing further and further west. The distance to Poland was rapidly decreasing, and for the first time so clearly, an inevitable realization began to emerge. The war in the East was no longer being fought. She was being lost. The destruction of Army Group Center was not merely an operational defeat. It was the moment when the strategic balance of the war definitively tipped against Nazi Germany, and the advance that had begun in the fields of Belarus would not stop in Minsk. He would press on, crossing borders, fording rivers, pushing German forces ever closer to his own territory. The road to Poland was open, and beyond that, the road to Berlin began to take shape on the horizon. While the Red Army advanced westward and what remained of Army Group Center dissolved in the fields of Belarus. In Berlin, reality began to impose itself with a suffocating weight. The reports arrived fragmented, often incomplete. Some messages spoke of surrounded divisions, others of lost cities. There were enormous gaps between one communication and another, gaps that in practice meant entire units had disappeared. Among the German High Command, the initial reaction was disbelief. How could an entire army be destroyed in just a few weeks? For years, the center of the Eastern Front had been considered relatively stable. It wasn't the sector of major German victories, but neither was it seen as the most vulnerable. Now, this false sense of stability was proving to be a fatal illusion. When the numbers started to become clear, hundreds of thousands dead, wounded and captured, the psychological impact was devastating. It wasn't just about human losses. It was the perception that the Red Army had reached a level of coordination, strength, and operational maturity that Germany could no longer match. Within the Nazi leadership circle, the search for those responsible was immediate. Commanders were dismissed. Officers were held accountable for lack of firmness. Some were removed from their posts on charges of incompetence. Others simply disappeared from strategic positions, but the truth was deeper than individual failings. The German system was overburdened. It was fighting on multiple fronts. It faced increasing shortages of fuel, aircraft and new tanks. Industry was still producing, but it could no longer keep pace with the losses. Furthermore, the confidence in German invincibility, so carefully cultivated in the early years of the war, was crumbling. The comparison with Stalingrad became inevitable, but there was a fundamental difference. Stalingrad was a catastrophe concentrated in a single city. The destruction of Army Group Center involved a vast area, multiple cities, and dozens of divisions. It was a complete operational collapse. Inside Germany, news was carefully filtered through propaganda, but rumors circulated. Wounded returning soldiers told stories of sieges, incessant bombings, and Soviet tanks appearing in unexpected places. The feeling that the Eastern Front was collapsing began to spread quietly. For many professional Wehrmacht officers, the conclusion was becoming increasingly clear. Germany no longer had sufficient reserves to stabilize the situation in the long term. Each new Soviet offensive pushed the lines closer to the border. Simple. The Red Army set the pace, and Berlin was simply trying to survive the aftermath. The psychological shock wasn't just in the numbers or the lost cities. He was silently realizing that the tide of war had turned irreversibly. And with each Soviet advance, the horizon over Berlin became less secure. As the final reports began to be compiled and the maps updated, many German officials and even foreign observers began to make an inevitable comparison: Minsk or Stalingrad. Stalingrad had been a symbol, a long, brutal battle, fought street by street, house by house, under a relentless winter. The surrender of the German Sixth Army in 1943 was a monumental shock to the world. But what happened in Belarus during Operation Bagration was different. It was bigger. In just a few weeks, it wasn't just one army surrounded in a city. It was virtually an entire group of armies wiped out. The destruction didn't occur in the beginning of the strategic turning point. Minsk represented the brutal confirmation that Germany would no longer be able to regain the initiative in the east. The difference was also in the speed. In Stalingrad, the siege took time to consolidate and months to reach its final conclusion. In Bagration, the collapse was swift, almost overwhelming. German defenses were breached at multiple points simultaneously. Cities considered fortresses fell in days. Soviet mobile forces exploited every breach with ruthless efficiency, and the territorial impact was gigantic. After Minsk, the Red Army advanced rapidly into Poland. The German line retreated hundreds of kilometers in a few weeks. It was a massive displacement of the front, something that would require months to reorganize, if that were even possible. Militarily, this meant that Germany was not only losing battles, it was losing vital space, strategic depth, resources, and maneuverability. The numbers spoke for themselves. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, thousands of vehicles destroyed or captured, entire depots lost. The logistical structure of Army Group Center ceased to exist. And perhaps the most devastating thing was the silent symbolism. For years, German propaganda maintained the image of a technically superior, disciplined army capable of withstanding any attack. But Operation Bagration showed something different. It showed a mature, coordinated Red Army, capable of planning complex offensives and executing them with devastating precision. If Stalingrad was the blow that severely wounded Nazi Germany in the east, Minsk was the blow that broke its backbone. After Belarus, for Germany, the war ceased to be an attempt to win. It became a struggle to delay the inevitable, and the inevitable was drawing closer with every kilometer that the Soviet tanks advanced toward the heart of Europe. After the fall of Minsk, the map of the war in the east was never the same again. Imagine, for a moment, the scale of what had happened. An entire front had simply collapsed. Cities that for 3 years had been German strongholds were now in smoldering ruins, occupied by Soviet troops. Roads once marked with signs in German were now traversed by columns of the Red Army advancing relentlessly. Belarus was lost, and with it, the illusion that Germany could stabilize the Eastern Front. What remained of Army Group Center was no longer a coherent force. It was a hodgepodge of fragmented units, officers attempting to reorganize makeshift defensive lines, and exhausted soldiers being sent to positions they knew they couldn't hold for long. Meanwhile, the Red Army gave no quarter. Soviet forces advanced toward the Vistula River, crossing eastern Poland. Cities like Brest-Litovsk, Grodno and Białystok were taken in succession. Each victory pushed the front line further west, closer to the heart of the Reich. And it wasn't just a territorial issue, it was psychological. Soviet soldiers knew they were now fighting not only to defend their homeland, but to enter occupied Europe. Many carried with them memories of the German invasion of 1941, burned villages, dead families, devastated cities. The march westward was also a march of revenge. On the journey, silent fear. Experienced officers realized that Soviet operational superiority could no longer be ignored. The Luftwaffe could barely protect the ground. Columns. Artillery was running low. Fuel was scarce. Reinforcements were either getting younger or getting older. Germany was now fighting on two fronts under maximum pressure. In the west, the Allies advanced after D-Day. In the east, the Red Army was crushing what remained of the German military backbone. And all of this was accelerated by what happened in Minsk. The destruction of Army Group Center opened a direct strategic corridor to Poland and, eventually, to Germany itself. It was not merely a tactical victory. It was a historic breakthrough, the road to the bloody path to Berlin.